The night was silent, except for the faint sound of dragging paws against the damp pavement. A lone wolf dog emerged from the darkness, its body trembling with exhaustion. The moonlight cast a silver glow on its matted fur, revealing deep scratches and patches of dried blood. It was clear this creature had been through a brutal journey. The streets were empty, save for a few flickering streetlights and the distant hum of passing cars. The wolf dog staggered forward, its amber eyes locked onto a glowing sign just ahead, Silver Creek Veterinary Clinic. The scent of antiseptic and warm bodies wafted through the air, calling to the wounded animal like a beacon in the void. With one final burst of strength, the wolf dog stumbled to the glass doors and collapsed. Its ribs heaved with every shallow breath. A soft whimper escaped its throat before darkness pulled it under. Inside the clinic, Dr. Evelyn Hart was finishing her paperwork for the night. The faint murmur of the television played in the background as she leaned back in her chair, rubbing her tired eyes. Her assistant, Noah, had just finished cleaning the examination table when a sharp scratching sound came from the entrance. "You hear that?" Noah frowned, pausing mid-motion. Dr. Hart nodded. The sound came again, weak but insistent. Without hesitation, she strode toward the door and pulled it open. Her breath caught. Lying at her feet was the largest wolf dog she had ever seen. Even in its weakened state, its size was imposing. But what shook her most were its eyes. Though dulled with fatigue, they held a fierce determination like something unfinished still burned within it. "Noah, help me get him inside," she called urgently. Together, they lifted the limp body onto the examination table. The wolf dog barely reacted, only twitching slightly as Dr. Hart ran her hands gently over its frame. Scars crisscrossed its body, some old, some fresh. Its paws were torn, cracked, as if it had traveled for miles without rest. "This poor thing's been through hell," Noah muttered, filling a bowl with water. Dr. Hart reached for her stethoscope when her fingers brushed against something beneath the thick fur collar. She carefully wiped away the grime, revealing a set of worn letters. "Return me to Leon." Dr. Hart froze. The name sent a jolt through her memory. She had seen it before years ago. A boy with bright eyes and a laugh full of life. A German Shepherd pup, bounding into the clinic for its first checkup. Her gaze flickered back to the wolf dog. It wasn't just any stray. This animal had a home, a story, a purpose. And it had fought its way back for something. Or someone. "We need to find Leon," she said, her voice firm. Now, the soft hum of the clinic's medical equipment filled the quiet room. The wolf dog lay motionless on the table, its breathing slow but steady. Dr. Hart worked quickly, cleaning the wounds and stitching up the worst of them. Each touch revealed more signs of hardship: broken claws, old scars, a body that had been pushed beyond its limits. Noah stood nearby, watching with furrowed brows. "What kind of dog survives something like this?" he muttered. Dr. Hart didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached down and gently ran her fingers over the collar again. "Return me to Leon." The words felt heavier now. Leon. She had met a Leon before years ago. Could it be the same boy? She turned to Noah. "Check the records. Look for any old files under the name Leon." Noah nodded and hurried to the reception desk, tapping quickly on the keyboard. Meanwhile, Dr. Hart focused on stabilizing the wolf dog. She administered fluids through and for, watching as the liquid slowly worked its way into the animal's system. Minutes passed. Then, a sudden sound made her freeze. A deep, rumbling growl. She turned sharply. The wolf dog's amber eyes were open. Weak, but alert. Dr. Hart took a slow step back, her hands raised in a calming gesture. "Easy there, you're safe now." The wolf dog's muscles twitched, but it didn't move. Its gaze flickered around the room before settling on the glass door. A look of urgency flashed in its eyes. Dr. Hart followed its gaze. "You're trying to go somewhere, aren't you?" she murmured. Just then, Noah rushed back in. "Got something?" he announced. "A file from 7 years ago. A boy named Leon Torres. He brought in a German Shepherd puppy for vaccinations. Said it was his best friend." Dr. Hart's heart clenched. 7 years. That puppy would be fully grown now, but it wasn't here. Only this wolf dog had returned. She looked at the exhausted animal before her. If this really was Leon's dog, then something had happened. Something that had pushed it to survive against all odds just to find its way back. What had it endured? And more importantly, where was Leon? Dr. Hart's mind raced as she absorbed the information. 7 years. A puppy had walked into this clinic all those years ago, but now only this battered wolf dog remained. Where was Leon? What had happened between then and now? She glanced at the animal. Its amber eyes still locked on the door as if waiting for someone to walk through. Its body trembled with exhaustion, but its will to move forward hadn't faded. There was something powerful in its gaze, something urgent. Noah scrolled through the file, his eyes narrowing. Leon Torres. He lived on Willow Street back then, but there's no updated address. Last visit was routine. Vaccines, regular checkup. Nothing unusual. He hesitated, then added, but he hasn't been back since. Dr. Hart processed that. If Leon had moved, the wolf dog had likely been searching for him. But for how long? And why? The wolf dog shifted slightly, a deep but weak growl escaping its throat. Dr. Hart instinctively placed a calming hand on its head. Hey, it's okay. We're trying to help. Surprisingly, the growl faded. The animal's body relaxed, but its eyes never lost that sharp, determined edge. Noah exhaled. So, what now? Call animal control. Try to track down Leon's family. Dr. Hart shook her head. No. This dog didn't come all this way for nothing. It wants to find Leon. And if we don't help, it might try running again. She hesitated before adding, I need to find out what happened. She reached for her phone and dialed the last number on file. The call rang several times before a voice finally answered. It was faint, tired. Hello, hi, this is Dr. Hart from Silver Creek Veterinary Clinic. She glanced at the wolf dog. I think I have your dog. Silence. Then a sharp inhale. That's impossible. Dr. Hart's grip tightened on the phone. I'm looking at him right now. He's in bad shape, but he made it here. His collar says return me to Leon. A shaky breath came through the line. Then, finally, the voice broke. Shadow. Dr. Hart glanced at the wolf dog, the name hanging in there like a whisper from the past. The animal's ears perked ever so slightly, though its body remained still. Yes, she said softly. Is this Leon? Another silence, heavier this time. Then the voice, barely above a whisper. Leon isn't here anymore. Dr. Hart's fingers tightened around the phone. The weight in the caller's voice sent a shiver through her. What do you mean Leon isn't here anymore? She asked carefully. Another pause, then the voice, now strained, hollow, replied, Leon passed away 6 months ago. The words hung heavy in the air. Dr. Hart exhaled slowly, glancing at the wolf dog lying on the examination table. Shadow. That was his name. And he had spent 6 months searching for a boy who was no longer there. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. This animal had fought through unimaginable hardships, braving the unknown, just to come home only to find home didn't exist anymore. On the other end of the line, the voice continued, I'm his mother, Maria Torres. Who? How did you find Shadow? Dr. Hart hesitated before answering. He found us. He showed up at my clinic tonight, barely alive. It looks like he's been on the road for months. A muffled sob came through the phone. He was missing. The night Leon Maria's voice broke. He disappeared. I thought he was gone forever. Dr. Hart swallowed the lump in her throat. He never stopped looking for Leon. The silence that followed was thick with grief. Shadow stirred slightly, his ears twitching. Though exhausted, he was still listening. As if deep down, he knew they were talking about the boy he had loved so fiercely. Dr. Hart took a deep breath. Maria, Shadow needs you. He's weak, but he's alive. And I think he came back because he didn't want to give up on Leon. Another choked sob. Then, after a long pause, Maria whispered, I'm coming. Dr. Hart hung up and placed her phone down, exhaling deeply. Noah stood frozen, his face pale. 6 months, he muttered. He's been out there, alone, for 6 months. Dr. Hart nodded. And he never gave up. She looked down at Shadow, her heart aching. He came home for Leon. Shadow's eyes fluttered open slightly at the sound of the name. His breathing remained shallow, but his ears perked ever so faintly. Even now, in his weakest moment, he was holding on. Noah let out a slow breath. What do we do now? Dr. Hart glanced toward the front door, then back at Shadow. We wait. And so they did. The clinic was silent except for the soft hum of medical monitors. Outside, the night stretched on, cold and endless. But inside, Bathed in the dim glow of the clinic lights, Shadow lay curled on the examination table, his heartbeat weak but steady. He had made it this far. He had survived the impossible. And now, after 6 months of searching, after losing everything, he was finally home. The sound of tires crunching against the gravel outside the clinic broke the heavy silence. Dr. Hart glanced at the clock just past 2 in the morning. She stood as the front door opened, revealing a woman with tired eyes and trembling hands. Maria Torres. Her face was pale, her lips slightly parted as if she had forgotten how to breathe. She didn't look at Dr. Hart. Her eyes searched past her, scanning the room, desperate for someone. Then she saw him. Shadow lay motionless on the examination table, his chest rising and falling in shallow, rhythmic breaths. For a moment, she didn't move. Then, with a strangled sob, she rushed forward. "Shadow," Maria whispered, her voice breaking. She reached out, her fingers hesitating just above his fur as if afraid he might disappear the moment she touched him. Slowly, she placed her hand on his head. His fur was rough and kempt, but warm. Shadow stirred at the touch, his ears twitching slightly. His breathing hitched, then steadied. Dr. Hart watched as Maria's expression crumbled, silent tears slipping down her cheeks. "You came back," she murmured. The wolf dog let out a weak sound, half a whimper, half a sigh. His amber eyes opened slightly, hazy and tired but filled with something else. Recognition. Even through exhaustion, through pain and months of wandering, he knew. Maria. She was still here. A shudder ran through his body, as if relief itself was too much to bear. His tail, though barely moving, gave a faint wag. Maria let out a broken laugh, running her fingers through his fur. "Oh, baby, I thought I lost you." Dr. Hart swallowed the lump in her throat, stepping back to give them space. Noah shifted beside her, his arms crossed tightly as if trying to keep his emotions in check. They had seen countless reunions between lost pets and their owners before, but this was different. This wasn't just relief, this was something deeper. Maria took a shaky breath and looked at Dr. Hart. "You saved him." Dr. Hart shook her head. "He saved himself. He never stopped looking for Leon." At the mention of the name, Maria flinched. Her eyes filled with fresh grief as she brushed a hand over Shadow's ears. "Leon loved him more than anything," she whispered. "They were inseparable. He would have," she swallowed hard. "He would have been so happy to see him again." Shadow let out another soft sound, nudging his head against Maria's palm. It was a small movement, but it carried 1,000 unspoken words. He had come back. Even though Leon wasn't here, Shadow had made it home. And now, lying in the warmth of familiar hands, he could finally rest. Maria didn't let go of Shadow's fur, her fingers tracing over the old scars that lined his body. She could feel the ridges where wounds had long since healed, the rough patches where fur had never fully grown back. Each mark told a story of survival, of unwavering loyalty, of a promise that not even time or distance could break. She inhaled shakily, trying to steady herself, but the grief was still raw. 6 months had passed, but it still felt like yesterday that she had last seen Leon. Still felt like a dream she couldn't wake from. And now, here was Shadow, carrying the weight of those months, returning from a journey no one could understand but him. Dr. Hart spoke gently. "He needs rest. He's malnourished, dehydrated, and his paws are in bad shape, but he's strong. He made it this far." Maria nodded, her eyes never leaving Shadow's face. "Can he come home with me?" The words were soft, hesitant, almost afraid of the answer. Dr. Hart considered it for a moment before nodding. "I'll prescribe medication for his wounds and something to help with the pain. He'll need time, but with care, he should recover." Maria let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. "Thank you." With Noah's help, they carefully lifted Shadow from the table. He was frighteningly light, his once muscular frame reduced to little more than skin and bone, but as they carried him outside, his body remained relaxed, his trust in them unshaken. The night air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant pine. The sky stretched above them, endless and quiet. Maria opened the back seat of her car, arranging blankets to make a soft space before they carefully placed Shadow inside. He let out a faint sigh as he sank into the warmth, his body curling instinctively. Maria slid into the driver's seat, her hands gripping the wheel. She glanced in the rearview mirror, watching Shadow's tired form. For a moment, she imagined Leon sitting beside him, running his hands through the wolf dog's fur, whispering in that soft, affectionate tone he always used. The image made her chest tighten, but she forced herself to take a deep breath. Shadow was home. And in some way, that meant a part of Leon was too. The drive was silent, save for the rhythmic hum of the tires against the pavement. Maria's mind drifted to the past, to memories of Leon and Shadow together, how they would run through the fields behind their old house, how Leon would fall asleep with Shadow curled at his feet. The way they had looked at each other, as if speaking a language only they could understand. She swallowed hard. Losing Leon had been unbearable. But now, with Shadow back, it felt like a small piece of him had returned. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to hold on to. The car rolled to a stop in front of a modest house, its porch light casting a warm glow against the dark. Maria stepped out, opening the back door and kneeling beside Shadow. "We're home," she murmured, stroking his head gently. Shadow's eyes flickered open, and for the first time since she had seen him, there was something softer in them. Recognition. Relief. He let out a breath and, with great effort, lifted his head slightly. Maria smiled through her tears. "Come on, baby. Let's go inside." Maria carried Shadow inside, her steps careful, her heart hammering against her ribs. The house was quiet, steeped in memories. The furniture remained unchanged, as if time had stopped the moment Leon left. Framed photographs lined the walls. Leon as a baby, as a child, his arms wrapped around a young Shadow, both of them grinning at the camera. The sight of it nearly shattered her resolve, but she focused on the present. Shadow was here now, and he needed her. She guided him to a thick blanket she had laid out beside the couch, helping him ease onto the soft surface. The wolf dog let out a tired sigh, his body curling slightly, but his eyes never left her. Maria stroked his fur, her voice barely above a whisper. "You can rest now, sweetheart. You made it home." For the first time in months, Shadow truly relaxed. His breathing was still shallow, but the tension in his muscles had faded. Maria stayed beside him, watching his chest rise and fall, memorizing every detail. He was thinner, his fur duller, but he was still Shadow. He was still the same loyal soul who had loved Leon with everything he had. And he had come back, even when the world had tried to break him. Tears pricked her eyes, but she forced herself to stay calm. Shadow didn't need her sorrow. He needed warmth, safety, and time to heal. Hours passed in a blur. She fed him small amounts of food, careful not to overwhelm his weakened stomach. She cleaned his wounds again, whispering reassurances with every touch. And through it all, Shadow never looked away from her. It was as if he was still waiting for something. Or someone. Maria knew what that meant. She reached for a small wooden box on the shelf, hesitating for only a second before opening it. Inside were Leon's belongings, things she hadn't been able to part with. A folded hoodie, a sketchbook, and a worn leather bracelet he had never taken off. Her fingers trembled as she picked up the hoodie, pressing it against her chest before slowly bringing it to Shadow. "Here, baby," she murmured. "It still smells like him." The moment the fabric touched Shadow's nose, something in him shifted. His body stiffened slightly, then melted into the scent, his eyes fluttering shut. A sound soft, broken escaped him, something between a sigh and a whimper. His paws curled around the hoodie, as if holding onto it. Maria bit her lip to keep from sobbing. "I miss him too," she whispered. The next morning, Shadow stirred at the first rays of sunlight streaming through the window. He lifted his head, weak but alert, his ears twitching at the familiar creaks of the house. Maria was there, sitting on the couch, her eyes heavy with exhaustion but filled with something softer. "Hope?" She reached down, running her fingers through his fur. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said softly. "You're safe now." Shadow let out a low breath, his body relaxing again. He was home. And though Leon was gone, his presence was everywhere, in the walls of this house, in the scent of the hoodie he held onto, in the warmth of the woman who had welcomed him back. For the first time in months, Shadow closed his eyes, not from exhaustion, but from peace. He had made it. The days passed in a quiet rhythm, each one feeling both precious and fleeting. Shadow had grown stronger, his wounds healing, his fur regaining some of its luster, but there was something in his eyes that remained unchanged. A quiet sadness, an unspoken longing. He followed Maria everywhere, his movements slower but still purposeful, as if he was afraid she would disappear if he looked away. She knew what he was searching for. No matter how warm the house was, no matter how much love she gave him, it wasn't the same. Shadow was waiting for someone who would never return. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Maria found herself sitting beside Shadow on the porch, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink. She ran her fingers through his fur, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. "You miss him, don't you?" she murmured. Shadow didn't move, but his ears twitched slightly at the sound of her voice. She let out a small, sad chuckle. "I do too." The air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves. Shadow had always loved autumn. She remembered how he and Leon would play outside for hours, rolling in the leaves, chasing each other until they were too exhausted to move. Now, the yard was quiet. No laughter, no running footsteps, just the rustle of leaves in the wind. That night, Maria left Leon's hoodie beside Shadow's bed. It was old and worn, but still carried traces of his scent, his warmth. Shadow curled around it, pressing his nose into the fabric, his body trembling slightly. Maria watched from the doorway, her heart breaking all over again. She knew he was holding on, but she also knew he was tired. The next morning, Shadow didn't wake up at his usual time. He remained curled up in his bed, his breathing slow and steady, but his eyes barely opened when Maria knelt beside him. "Hey, sweetheart," she whispered, stroking his head gently. "Are you feeling okay?" Shadow let out a soft sigh, his tail giving a faint wag. But there was a heaviness in the way he moved, a deep exhaustion that went beyond the physical. Maria swallowed the lump in her throat. She had seen this before. She spent the whole day with him, refusing to leave his side. She fed him by hand, spoke to him in hushed tones, reminded him of all the good times. Shadow listened, his amber eyes fixed on her, but she could see at the distant look, the way his body sank deeper into the blankets. That evening, as the sky darkened, she wrapped a warm blanket around him and lay beside him, whispering softly. "You don't have to stay for me," she said, her voice shaking. "You've been so strong, for so long. If you're tired, it's okay. You can rest now." Shadow exhaled slowly, pressing his head against her hand. His tail wagged one last time, and then, as the wind outside carried the scent of autumn through the open window, he closed his eyes. Maria sat frozen, her hands still resting on Shadow's head as the weight of the moment settled over her. The house was silent, save for the distant ticking of the old clock on the wall. She had known this day would come, had felt it in the way Shadow had slowed down, in the tired look in his eyes. But knowing didn't make it easier. Her chest tightened, grief swelling inside her like a wave threatening to pull her under. She took a shuddering breath, forcing herself to stay calm. Shadow deserved that, deserved peace, deserved love even in his final moments. She leaned down, pressing her forehead gently against his. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "For finding your way back. For loving him. For loving me." The tears she had been holding back finally spilled over, falling onto his fur as she sat there, unwilling to move, and willing to let go. The night stretched on, long and endless. Maria eventually reached for her phone with trembling fingers and called Dr. Hart. The veterinarian arrived within the hour, her expression soft with understanding as she knelt beside Maria. "He was ready," Dr. Hart murmured. Maria nodded, unable to speak. She stroked Shadow's fur one last time before allowing Noah and Dr. Hart to help her. They wrapped him in the same blanket he had been curled in, treating him with the same care and respect he had always shown to those he loved. Maria barely registered the motions, her mind drifting through years of memories. Shadow as a puppy, chasing Leon through the fields, the way he would curl up at the foot of his bed, always waiting, always watching over him. Even in the end, he had stayed. He had never stopped waiting. The next morning, the world felt different. The house was too quiet, too still. Maria moved through it as if in a dream, her fingers trailing over picture frames, over Leon's belongings, over the empty space where Shadow's bed had been. Every step felt heavier, like the weight of the past was trying to anchor her down. She walked out to the backyard, where the early morning mist clung to the grass, and knelt down in the soft earth. With Noah's help, they laid Shadow to rest beneath the old oak tree, the same tree where Leon used to play, where Shadow would lie in the shade on hot summer days. Maria placed a smooth stone over the fresh earth, running her fingers over its surface before whispering, "You're home now." The days blurred together after that. Maria kept expecting to hear the soft padding of paws following her through the house, to see a pair of amber eyes watching her from the doorway. But the house remained silent. Still, even in the quiet, she felt him. In the whisper of the wind through the trees, and the warmth of the sun filtering through the windows, and the way the floor creaked softly at night, as if someone was still keeping watch. Shadow was gone, but he had never really left. Winter had settled in, bringing with it the first gentle snowfall of the season. Maria sat by the window, watching the flakes drift lazily to the ground. The house still felt quiet, too quiet, but the weight of grief was no longer as suffocating as before. Time had softened the pain, turning it into something more bittersweet, a memory that no longer felt like a wound, but a whisper of love that would never fade. One afternoon, as she sorted through old mail, her phone rang. Dr. Hart's voice came through, warm but hesitant. "Maria, I know this might be too soon, but we have a pup here, a German Shepherd mix. Someone abandoned him at the clinic. He's small, but strong. And he reminds me a little of..." She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't have to. Maria closed her eyes, her heart clenching. She had promised herself she wouldn't rush into this, that no dog could ever replace Shadow. But this wasn't about replacing. This was about continuing. About love finding a way, even through loss. That evening, she drove to the clinic. The moment she stepped inside, a small, wobbly-legged puppy bounded toward her, his oversized ears flopping as he nearly tripped over himself. His fur was a mix of soft grays and browns, his eyes a deep, familiar amber. He looked up at her, tail wagging furiously, and for the first time in months, Maria laughed. Dr. Hart smiled. "Looks like he's already chosen you." Maria knelt down, hesitating only for a second before reaching out. The puppy licked her fingers, his tiny body pressing into her warmth without hesitation. He was trusting her, the way Shadow once had. She swallowed past the lump in her throat and whispered, "Welcome home, little one." That night, as the snow continued to fall, Maria sat on the couch, the puppy curled against her side. She glanced toward the old oak tree in the backyard, where Shadow rested, and felt a quiet sense of peace. Love never truly left. It just found new ways to return.